Record now. Record. Okay, so let's take a look as an overview now of chapter 9. And let me re-highlight some of the questions we talked about. Remember that the first half of the chapter, they read the Torah. The Jews wanted to fast and mourn. They were told they cannot. Then they celebrated Rosh Hashanah. They celebrated Sukkot. And then instead of beginning on the beginning of the 24th of Tishrei, we know that it says that they began on the 25th of Tishrei to start with their fasting, to start with their mourning. I'm sorry, instead of the 23rd, go on to the 24th. And we're going to see why in a few minutes. Those who had intermarried decided to separate from their wives, and we raised a question like, wait a minute, that's something that Ezra already had done. And in addition to that, the Bnei Israel, the community, has a public confession. They read part of the Torah part of the day, which they say is a quarter of the day. They do vidui or confession for another quarter of the day, and they bow down to Hashem for part of the day. And Levi'im, this long tefillah, where they start off by saying, get up and praise Hashem. Levi'im then give this whole long Jewish history lesson, starting with the creation, not just Jewish history, but world history and then Jewish history, acknowledging, of course, Hashem as the creator. Then going into, I have it here, listed it, Avraham Avinu, the miracles of the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the protection in the desert, the Hitgalut, of course, Parshat Yitro on Har Sinai, which we just read yesterday. And then, of course, reminding us that in spite of his good that Hashem always was doing for us, we consistently rebelled against Hashem, whether it was in Egypt, after we were getting out of Egypt with the golden calf, whether it was the Meraglim, whether it was after that when we came in the time of the Shoftim, when there was all the idolatry, and Hashem, so to speak, had to remind us that we were messing up and kept sending our oppressors against us. And then once the Jews inhabit the land, it's the pasuk from the Torah, Vayishman Yishurun Vayivat, that Bnei Yisrael became fatted, and they got used to it, and this is what we get, and we deserve all this. And of course, there's some rebellion there, and that's the spiritual rebellion, and they're taught their lesson, and they, so to speak, toss away the Torah at that point. So as a punishment at that point, Hashem, and again, this is the lesson, this is the history lesson that the Levim are giving to Am Yisrael, or Bnei Yisrael at this point. The land is given over to the hands of the Oivim, to the hands of the enemies. And in spite of all that, the Levim point out that Hashem's compassion remains with Bnei Yisrael, that even though they were not following the Torah, even though they were not keeping their end of the bargain, of the deal, which is the brit between Hashem and Am Yisrael, nevertheless, Hashem still continue to give, whether it was in the desert with the man, or in the land of Israel with the rain, whatever it might have been. And they ended the parak with the Levi'im doing a series of vidui, of confession, and the kings, the priests, the Kohanim, the officers, have all defied Hashem's teachings. And the Jews are, the biggest problem now is that the Jews, even though they have Beit HaMikdash, they're not autonomous. We don't have the rule of the land. They are subservient to or servants of a foreign country. So I want to discuss a couple things. Let me see, I have notes here on 1, 2, 3 or 4 things I want to talk about this chapter. And without, only going to be one slide tonight, and that's going to come up before we finish this chapter. Let's talk about the idea of separating from their non-Jewish spouses. If you remember in Sefer Ezra, I think it was also in Parak Tet, chapter 9, that Ezra, one of his big moves was to have the Jews separate from their non-Jewish wives. So the problem is, how is it over here that we still seem to have this problem of the intermarriage? So there are a couple of opinions. The Ralbag says that there were new Olim that came from Bavel in the meantime, from the time Ezra came until the time of Nehemiah, that during that time period, there were new Olim, and they came with foreign wives. They came with non-Jewish wives, and it is those that they are separating from. The Dath Mikra has a different opinion. It says as follows, that when we read the parak in chapter 9 of Ezra, it sounded like, okay, they had all this problem. Ezra made the edict. Everyone agreed. They separated from their wives. But evidently, according to Dath Mikra, it was a limited success. It wasn't everybody. And that now those who had not separated from their wives in the parak in Sefer Ezra, now at Nehemiah, when the Levim are talking to them, they make the decision to separate from their wives. Now, who's right? I don't know. No one can know for sure. That's very true, by the way, in what's it called? In commentaries from the Torah. You could have Rashi says one thing, Ramban says something, Sforno says something, Ralbag says something. You'd have 25 different opinions. We don't know for sure in some of these cases who's right. So that's the concept of Shivim Panim LaTorah. We've talked about this before, both in terms of in Navi and in other areas, that as long as the interpretation of a pasuk falls within the purview of, it doesn't lose its meaning from the text. In other words, if it says that they separated from their foreign wives, and you say, oh, you know what that means? It means they all remarried non-Jews, then they got separate. There's nowhere that indicates something like that. But the other possibility is that everyone had not yet separated, or there were new people that came. Both could fit into the narrative, so they both could potentially be right. Again, who is correct? We don't know for sure. I can't tell you for sure. No one can. Now, we said that the parsha begins, the parak begins. Let me just pull it up on the screen for a second. My screen. Oh, I have the book right in front of me. Why don't I just do that? That'll be helpful. And if you open up to the very beginning, the parak text says as follows. Enough pages to turn. I'll eventually get. Here we go. It was on the 24th of this month, meaning Tishrei. Bnei Israel gathered in fasting, putting on sackcloth, and putting dirt on their heads. So we know that the holiday of Sukkot is over on the 22nd of the month. But why would not have been on the 23rd that they did this? So I'm sure many of you have already figured the answer to this one. So the Chachamim say that this is probably the source for the concept, the Malbi mentions this, that of the concept of Isru Chag. What is Isru Chag? It's the day after Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the very next day, which is a regular weekday, but it takes on a certain level of prominence and importance. It's called Isru Chag. And when you think about it also, it's not for this reason, but in Chutz La'aretz, on our Isru Chag, it's always Chag there. So like our second day, the day after Shavuot, this year it's Shabbat to make a difference. But normally you'll say Shavuot is on the middle of the week. So we have one day. So the second day, so to speak, the next day, when it's over, for us, it's just a weekday. In Chutz La'aretz, it's still a Chag. So to have our day here to be with Tachanun and everything else, while in Chutz La'aretz is a Chag, it may be considered somewhat of a contradiction. Not that we are Kovea whatsoever based on Chutz La'aretz, obviously. But at the same time, the idea was to not want to release ourselves, so to speak, so quickly from the Chag. And that's part of the idea behind Isru Chag. And therefore, says the Malbim, this is the potential source the Chachamim used for having the idea of Isru Chag. So instead of starting their fasting on the 23rd, which would have been the day after Sukkot, or rather Shmini Atzeret, they started on the 24th. In addition, let's talk about the daily davening for a minute. When we started learning Sefer Ezra, I commented that the people who lived at this time period, starting already with Mordechai, and with Ezra and Mordechai from the story of Purim, were the beginning of what was known as the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. We also know that the man named Shimon HaTzadik, which, by the way, my youngest daughter lives in Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood. Shimon HaTzadik was the last remnant of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. It spanned hundreds of years, and they are the ones who established our many things that we do, including they established, Gemara tells us, Shmona Esrei. It was miraculous that it could do this because it meant that 120 Jews gathered together and actually agreed together on a text. How it's changed over the years in different Edot, even among Ashkenazim, but especially among Sfaradim, and Nusach, what's called Nusach Sfarad, not Sfaradi. Also, there are changes, but the Gadol, the formula, the order, the basic text, and for sure, every single bracha is the same as far as the Chatima, Baruch Hashem, all are the same around the world in Dati, in religious circles. Now, they were called the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Now, right now is exactly the time to explain once again, if you have forgotten, why it's called, why they were called the men of the Great Assembly. So let's take a look at a Gemara. Okay, where you have this arrow here. It says, the Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, Lama nikra Sheman Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. They make this a little bit bigger even. I guess I can't. Can I? Oh, there we go. Why were they called the men of the Great Assembly? What was so great about them? Shechaziru atara liyoshna. They returned the crown to the days of old. What does that mean? Now, by the way, that's an expression that's used nowadays in many, many cases, sometimes for chol, sometimes for kodesh, but to return something to its original status, its stature, its grandiosity, whatever it might be. In what way did they return the crown of glory, so to speak, to its original state? Ata Moshe came along and said, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanora. Moshe Rabbeinu used these kinuyim, these appellations of God. Just as an aside, I want to mention one thing before I go on. The word, he calls Hashem El, Aleph Lamed. We refer to Hashem as Elohim, plural, which if you never thought about that, is kind of strange because Hashem's only one, right? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So we have one of the names of God is Elohim, which means the word El means power, like Michamocha Ba'elim Hashem. The word El means power. So Elohim means powers. So why in the world would we refer to Hashem as Elohim? Answer: because we don't say Hashem is powers, but rather we say Hashem is the source of all power. Anything I do, anything you do, the fact that water runs downhill, the fact that the sun moves, the fact that the stars move in the heavens, the fact that I can move my fingers, all that is because Hashem gave these items within nature, within the world, within the universe, the power to move. So it means he's the source of all nature. Okay, forget that. Let's move along. Yeah, don't forget that, but I'm saying let's move on to here. So Moshe referred to Hashem as Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Hanora, right? And we use those four words in the beginning of Shmona Esrei. But wait, what happened? After Yirmiyahu came along and said, Amar, and he said, they're non-Jews. They're doing cartwheels in the Beit HaMikdash. Where is your Norah? Where is the awesomeness of God? Lo Amar Norah. So therefore, when he referred to God, he did not use the word Norah. Ata Daniel Amar. Daniel came along and said, the non-Jews are subjugating his children. Where's the Gvurah? Where's the power of God? Lo Amar Gibor. So therefore, Daniel, referring to God, dropped that appellation of Hashem of Gibor. Atu Inhu, they came along, meaning the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, V'amru, and they said, Adrabah, just the opposite. Zohi Gvuroto. This is the Gvurah of Hashem. Shekoveshet Yitzo. He quenches his anger, his Yetzer. Shenoten Erechapayim L'Rishayim, because he doesn't punish even the Rishayim immediately, in order to give them a chance to maybe do the right thing. And this is also his greatness, his awesomeness. If it weren't for God, his morah, no nation would survive. Meaning, imagine for a moment that any nation that went against us, that would be wiped out. Alvai. I mean, all the bad guys. Well, we say it in the davening every day. It's not something new. We said and all that. We want to have them all messed with. But so what happens is, the point is that the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah come along They establish Shmona Esrei, and within the Shmona Esrei, at the very beginning, we say Hakela Gadola Gibor Vanora. Unlike the Nehemia and Daniel, who took away a couple of the words, not for Shmona Esrei, but for when they talked about Hashem. Now the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah returned those words, and therefore they're referred to as Anshe Knesset Hagdolah because of the fact that they brought back the original grandeur that Moshe Rabbeinu had established in referring to God. We start to see now something interesting, and we're going to see even more in the next chapter. We're going to start in a minute. Until this period, the Jews have Nevi'im. The Jews have a Navi who's able to guide them, who's able to instruct them, to say they're doing wrong, they're doing right. We're about to switch into a new period of Jewish history, what will be known in what's known as in English as Rabbinic Judaism. It is where the rabbinic community, the leadership, will have to start instituting various things in order to maintain Yahadut, to maintain Judaism, and to make sure it stays strong. We will not have, after this time period, my mind just went blank. Hold on. They'll come to me in a second. We end the time period shortly of Nevuah, of prophecy, and we move into this concept of rabbinic Judaism. And that will become really the legacy of Ezra and Nehemiah, the time period as they prepare the Jews to live. Even though we're going to have a Beit HaMikdash for quite a number of years after this, the relationship between the Jews and the Beit HaMikdash, the second temple period, is different than the relationship in the first one. And we're not going to discuss that more tonight. What I want to do is I want to take a look now at chapter 10, Perek Yud. I want to read it. And as I said before, some of you got on, we're going to read it. I'm going to give a summary of that, and we're going to talk about some of the highlights in this Perek that really is, I don't like the word touchstone, because that's a poor word, but it's maybe like a bit of a turning point. When you read Navi, when you read not just Navi, but you read Jewish history, and you see that there are certain things that happen that become turning points in Judaism. This is one of those, this next chapter, and we'll see why maybe tonight still. Let's go to the chapter. Let me pull it up on my screen here so I can have it. It's here. It's all next to me. Okay, we're going to start with the beginning of Perek Yud. And after the first couple psukim, I'm going to read, but with no translation because it's just names. And when we get to about pasuk, I think Kaftet, like number 29, so I'll go back into translation. Normally in modern Hebrew, the word v'cholzot means in spite of that. In this case, it means in light of all this that we just said. In other words, now remember, this isn't in a vacuum. This is the continuation of the time period, the Levim. We're talking to Bnei Israel. We're giving this history lesson. We're talking about how we have been given opportunity after opportunity that we've squandered, and nevertheless Hashem still did what it kept his part of the promise of the Brit. In view of all this, we are making a promise, and we're going to put it in writing. I mentioned to you last week at the very end, I think, that there's a very big difference to committing to something verbally versus committing to something in writing. Some people have everyone has their own method of dealing with self-motivation. Some people are not self-motivated. They need external motivation. But some people are self-motivated. I'll give you an example. Whenever I've tried to take off weight, what I do is I'll weigh myself. I'll write down the number where I'm at. And I put it in a prominent place that I can see it. It's my reminder where I'm holding, so to speak, that's what I don't want to be anything above that for sure. And I want to try and get down from that weight. Some people may want to decide they're going to go to Minyan twice a week. They don't go to Minyan. So they're going to say, okay, I'm going to commit, but I'm going to put it down in writing. I'm sending my friend a text. On Tuesdays and Wednesdays, I'm going to go to shul. Someone may say, you know what, I'm not so good about a shayatzar. So what do? They take a shayatzar paper or a little sign. They leave it outside their bathroom, and they take it in their hand. It's just something physical and tangible, as opposed to saying, I'm going to say Asher Yatzar. I'm going to go to the shul. I'm going to, lose weight. So now what Bnei Israel is doing is in this idea is they're going to write something ve'al hachatum. They're also going to sign on it and they're going to seal it. Sarenu levienu lekohanenu. So it's going to be the upper echelon of the community is going to sign on this. But in addition to that, we'll see others. Ve'al hachatumim, and on the sealed copy will be the following names: Nehemia Hatirshata ben Chachalia ben Tzikiah, Seraya Azariah Yirmiyah, Pashkor Amaya Malkiah, Hatush Shavanya Maluch, Harim Meremot Ovadia, Daniel Ginton Baruch Meshulam Aviyah Yamin, Me'azaya Bilgai, Shmaya Ela Kohanim. So that list is the first group of the Levi'im that signed. The Halevi'im, the Kohanim, the Halevi'im, Yeshua ben Azania, Binui, Mibnei Chenadad, Chad Kadmiel, V'achreihem, Shvanya, Hodia, Klita, Playa, Chanan, Micha, Rechov, Chashvaya, Hashavya, Zakur, Sherevya, Shavanya, Hodaya, Vani, Beninu, Rashei Am Parosh, Pachat Moav, Elam Zatu Bani. So among the heads of the people was this man Parosh and these other names. Buni Azgad Bevai. You can obviously see that many of these names are influenced by Babylonian and / Persian names. By the way, I imagine you know, but if you don't, you should know that the names Mordechai and Esther were not really Jewish names. They're based on two names, Mordechai and Ishtar. They became Jewish names as a result of the story of Mordechai and Esther, but they were not originally based on Jewish names. Adoniah Bigvai Adin Ater Chizkiah Azur Hodia Chashum Beitzai Charif Anatot Nevai Mag Piash Mishulam Chezir Mishay Zavel Tzedok Yadua Platia Hanan Anaya Hoshea Hananya Chashuv Halochesh Pilcha Shovek Rechum Chashavna Me'esaya V'achaya Hanan Anan Maluch Charim Bana Usharam. The rest of the people, HaKohanim, Halevi'im, HaShorim, HaMeshorim, HaNetinim. This is the list now that everybody from the people, the Kohanim, Levi'im, the gatekeepers, the singers. Remember, these names or titles should sound familiar to you already because of what we saw earlier in this book and what we saw in Sefer Ezra. The Meshorim, the singers, the Netinim, the lost place. This is an unusual statement we're going to come back to. And all those who separated themselves from the peoples of their land. What does that exactly mean? To follow the teaching of God, which sounds like maybe they're Gerim, maybe converts. Nishehem, B'nehem uvnotehem, they, their sons, their daughter, their wives, their children, Kol Yodei Mevim. All those, all who know enough to understand meaning what they were signing. What were they doing? Machazikim alachehem adirehem. They joined together with their brothers and ubaim be'Allah ubishua. They come with making an oath, a promise. Lalechet b'Torat Elokim. They're putting in writing that they're going to keep the Torah. Now, let me read the pasuk, and I'm going to present a question before we go further. They're signing an oath that they're going to follow Torah Elokim asher nitna b'yad Moshe v'ed Elokim, that was given through the hands of Moshe, the servant of Hashem, lishmor v'la'asot, to keep and to do kol mitzvot Hashem Adonenu, all the commandments of Hashem our God, u'mishpatav v'chukav, all the laws and statutes, the rules and regulations. Okay, so now at this point that should be sufficient, right? Because if I tell you I want you to commit to Torah, I want you to commit to a Torah life, and I want you to sign on a dotted line. And I write, I Zev Shanlov, I so-and-so, Ploni ben Ploni, say, I commit to the best of my ability to keep Torah mitzvot, as it is the Torah that Hashem gave to Moshe. What else do I need to say? Well, let's wait and see this more. Now, they are not only signing that they are going to keep Torah, but now they seem to say things that are either related to something in the Torah, expanding on things that are in the Torah, something that's not in the Torah. So it becomes a little bit of an interesting document that they're signing on, because listen to what else they say. In addition to just saying they're going to keep Torah mitzvot, they also say the following: that except they will not marry their daughters off to non-Jews, nor will they take their daughters to marry the Jews' sons. The people of the land who bring their stuff and all their food on Shabbat day to sell, we're not going to buy their wares, their stuff from them on Shabbat. And also, we're not going to use the produce of the 7th year, and we will not carry and collect any outstanding debt. Now, obviously, this pasuk seems to refer to a few things that we should be familiar with: no intermarriage, shmita, and what's called shmita ksafim, which is the idea of cancellation of loans. So it doesn't really sound necessarily like they're adding anything to the Torah, but there's certain delineating certain things. Maybe it's because this is areas that they have been weak in. That's possible. Lamed Gimel. Ve'emadnu aleinu mitzvot. They also agreed to do the following obligations upon themselves. They're going to charge themselves a third of a shekel a year to serve to the Beit HaMikdash. Well, there's nowhere in the Torah that says that. There's a machatzita shekel, there's a half a shekel. So what's more, a third or a half? And we know a third is 33.3%. We know a half is 50%. That's interesting. We're reading this now because this Shabbat we know we read Parshat Shkalim, which is always read on the Shabbat before Rosh Chodesh Adar or the Shabbat of Rosh Chodesh Adar. So why are they committing to something that's not in the Torah? That sounds like they're committing to less that's in the Torah this time. Now, they're also going to commit to other things that necessarily may or may not be in the Torah. Lelechem hamarechet, they also commit to having the bread on the rows and the shulchan, minchata tamid, ulata tamid, hashabatot, chodashim, the moadim, lekavdashim, lechataot, lechaper al Yisrael, b'chol melechet beit Elokeinu. They are committing to certain things that would take place in Beit HaMikdash. The meal offerings, the various korbanot for the Chagim, for Shabbatot, for Rosh Chodesh, and also korbanot for Bnei Yisrael when they sin, all to be in the house of Hashem, i.e. the Beit HaMikdash. Pasuk Lamed Hey 35. V'agoroti palu al kurban ha'itzim, hakohanim, halvi'im, v'ha'am. They've done another thing that they put in writing, that they are casting lots, that the Kohanim, Levi'im, and other people, not just Kohanim and Levi'im, commit to bringing wood sacrifices to the Beit HaMikdash. What was a wood sacrifice? So let's just briefly just touch on that. In order to burn the animals that were shechted, that were slaughtered, and put them on the top of Mizbeach, they had to have firewood. So the wood itself had to be brought. So they're committing themselves to doing something that apparently is not in the Torah. I'm mentioning that now. If we get to it, we'll see why. Specific times on an annual basis. Is to be used for fuel on the Mizbeach, as it says in the Torah of Hashem, which, by the way, doesn't command it. It states as a fact that there needs to be what's called the ma'arechet, the system, the framework, literally, of wood. Just as a parenthetical statement, there were many Kohanim that if they were Tameim, if they were ritually impure, they were unable to serve in the Beit HaMikdash, that they weren't allowed to bring korbanot, they couldn't do anything, but they did have a job still. And what their job was to go through and take the wood to check it for bugs, because if it was mitula, if it was buggy, they couldn't use that. It would be inappropriate to use that on the Mizbeach. And we just went through Tu B'Shvat last week, and was tied actually to Tu B'Shvat, which I'm not going to get into tonight, but if you want to look up something interesting, see one of the reasons of Tu B'Shvat being a special day, it had to do with the wood of the Beit HaMikdash. In addition to that, they take upon themselves another promise, Lamed Vav 36. We decide we're going to take upon ourselves to bring Bikurim, the first fruits from our land, Ubikurei kol pri kol eitz shana v'shana l'beit Hashem, to bring the first fruits from our ground of every fruit on of every tree. This is definitely not what the Torah tells us. The Torah tells us, by implication, that Bikurim was brought only from, this is the first fruits, from the Shivat Haminim, the 7 species, not from everything. If you had an apple tree, a pomelo tree, you didn't bring bikurim, yet they're accepting upon themselves to do this. And then they also, this is what I believe one of the last things they're accepting upon themselves, that they're going to bring the firstborn of their children and their animals, kakatu b'torah, that they're going to bring the firstborn of the cattle and the flock to the Beit HaMikdash, to the Kohanim. And all of they're going to bring to the Beit HaMikdash the beginning part of the dough they make and all the gifts of grains and every fruit of every tree and wine and oil to be brought to the Kohanim. It's Navi Kohanim. Lishchot Beit Elokeinu u'maser admatenu laleviim, and give maaser to the Leviim. That's kind of falling into concert with what says in the Torah. And the Levim themselves will collect the maaser in all the different cities. And Haya Kohen ben Aaron im Leviim, a Kohen from Aaron, a descendant of Aaron, has to be im Leviim ba'aser Levim. The Levim take or collect the maaser. There has to be a Kohen with him. Alvim ya'alu et maaser ba'aser lebeit Elokeinu, and they take the tithe, the 10th of the 10th, which is called Tumat Maser, to Beit HaMikdash, El HaLeshachot LeBeit HaOtzar. Ki El HaLeshachot Yaviu B'nei Yisrael B'nei HaLevi et Tumat HaDagan, Atirosh VaYitzar. It is to these storerooms, the Lishka, means an office, it also means a storeroom in this case. B'nei Yisrael would bring, and Levim would bring their Tumat HaDagan, Tirosh VaYitzar, their grips of grains and wines and oil, V'sham Klei HaMikdash, and there the various utensils of the Beit HaMikdash. Last thing they say, they're not going to, this literally means to leave, but more to like to neglect. They're not going to neglect the house of God. Now, this is a very long chapter, mostly because there's many chapter names. I think there's 89 names, 84, 89 names that are listed here. So it gives us a number of extra psukim, but at the same time, it's also a fascinating chapter having to do with what exactly is the purpose of this document. By the way, I'm going to answer a question that 2 of you asked me in person. I'm going to mention it here because let me take this off here for a second. That's big. 2 of you mentioned this question to me privately, and I thought I addressed it in the class, but I guess I didn't explain it enough. The question was, going back in the last chapter, before we get into this one, why give that whole history lesson? Why mention all those things? Hashem created the world, took us out of Egypt, we were in the desert, we messed up here, we messed up there, and then we come into Israel and messed up again. What was its purpose? So what it seems to be, and I thought I mentioned this, but if a couple of you asked me, it means I didn't make it clear enough. Nehemia, the Levim are the spokespeople in that chapter, 13 and keep saying 13, in Parak 9, Parak Tet, and Parak Yud, but it's all being orchestrated through Nehemia. This is a new time period for the Jews. Remember, they lived in Israel, had a Beit HaMikdash, they've been in Israel since the time of coming back from Mitzrayim. They lived for centuries in the land. Then over a period of approximately 130 years, as we see the latter part of Sefer Melachim, they're exiled in 3 different stages. There's still some Jews left. Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. They're gone for about 70 years. They come back, Shivat Zion, with Ezra, the whole Sefer Ezra, the beginning of Nehemiah, and they have Beit HaMikdash and everything else. They are seen now as having a new chance, a new lease on life of Judaism. Let's put a parenthesis here for a second and put something in context. And I've mentioned this before, probably at least 2 or 3 times, but I have to mention it again because it really fits here. In the Sefer Zechariah, after Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, or after they come back already from Bavel, the Jews go to Zechariah and ask him the question, should we fast on Tisha B'Av? Logical, legitimate question, because now they're back in Israel. They have a Beit HaMikdash, so should we fast? And Zechariah gives a very, very sharp answer. He doesn't say yes or no. He basically says, you're asking the wrong question. Question is not, should we fast? Question is, how in the world are we supposed to act so that we do not fall into the same trap as before and cause there to be a destruction of this Beit HaMikdash? What do we need to improve on so that we don't have to fast anymore, meaning we don't have to worry about a destroyed Beit HaMikdash? So everything is but through the prophets, through Zechariah, or through the leadership, Ezra, and especially now Nehemia, and the Leviim, is about this laying a foundation for the future. And the idea was in this long chapter, in chapter 9, of the history lesson and what we did wrong and what we did wrong and what we did wrong. And yet Hashem still sustained us. Hashem still gave us the manna. Hashem still protected us. Nevertheless, we still find ourselves under foreign rule now. Was to say we cannot make this mistake again. Our people cannot afford it. We don't know how long, I'm adding this right now, we don't know how long Hashem's patience will last with us. Now, what does that mean? Look in the Torah. And more than one occasion, Hashem turns to Moshe and says, that's it. I'm done with them. Wipe them out. Forget about it. Let me start over with you. Okay, so the concept is there already in the Torah. But Hashem is, again, what it would never have happened. Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. We're always going to be here. But the in theory idea was that the Levim are setting up this structure here that we have to make sure we have to keep in mind what our history is. You realize that for centuries we have messed up, and for centuries Hashem has still helped us. Let's do this right. We have a brand new Beit HaMikdash. Let's use it the right way. Let's bring the Torah and the Judaism outside the walls of the Beit HaMikdash, bring it into our lives, and do it the right way. And by the way, we're going to sign on it. We're going to commit ourselves in writing. We've seen in the Torah where there's been it's actually the end of this week's parasha, where there's actually a brit that is made, a covenant that's made with blood that's actually poured onto the people. But there's no concept of writing a commitment. And that's what's happening in this chapter. Between 9 and 10 is exactly what's happening. There's the history lesson. There's the we shouldn't be doing this again. And by the way, gentlemen, we're all signing on this. Men and women and whoever can. is going to sign on this document to say we're not going to do this again. And not that we're not going to do this again, but we're committing ourselves to do the right thing. As we commit ourselves to do the right thing, there are multiple things that are happening in there, or they're listed, that don't necessarily reflect the reality of the Torah. I want to talk about some of that now, actually. I mentioned, if you look back at Pasuk Kaftet, number 29, take a look at that for a second. As soon as I find it in mine, I'm going to reread the Pasuk to you. Okay. Kaftet. It says, Ushar ha'am ha'kohanim, Alvi'im, Mashorim, Amashorim, Anetinim. That's okay. We got all those titles and groups of people. And then it says, V'chol hanivdal me'amei haratzot ha'torat Elokim. And all those who separated from the people of their lands, to follow the teaching of Hashem. There's a similar pasuk in Ezra. You don't have to look it up right now, but just trust me on that. It talks about in Parak Vav, I have a note here somewhere, that the people who joined in separating themselves from the Tum'ah, the uncleanliness of the nations. Who are these people? So Rashi and Mitzudat David and the Malbim say that both in Ezra and Nehemia we're talking about converts. People who were not Jewish, who were inspired. And again, this is very timely because this past week we read Pashat Yitro, which says that by Yishma Yitro, Rashi asked, Vashama Uba, what is that Yitro heard and came? He heard about Melchemet Amalek, we heard about Kriyat Yam Suf. He was moved by it. So according to Rashi, Mitzudat David and Malbim, that the people referred to in Pasuk Kaftet, after the normal ones that we have listed, are converts. Interestingly enough, that we already mentioned this before, that Megillat Esther is written around the same time period of Ezra and Nehemiah, and has a similar pasuk. It talks about the Rabim Me'ha'am Mityahadid. Many of the non-Jews were becoming Jews, or were becoming at least supportive of the Jews. And Rashi again says, similarly to over here, that they converted. Rashi here also says either they converted or they were committing to convert or were willing to convert, but maybe had not yet. This resurgence in Yahadut, in Judaism, let's go back a second. I said to you before that when I was growing up, in my mind, the only people on earth were Jews. That's how I pictured it, whether it's Yitziat Mitzrayim or Avram Avinu. That wasn't until a little bit older that I started to realize, wait a minute, the Jews were only a fraction, as we are always in history, a fraction of the people on earth. And there are other things happening in the world. There are other nations, other people. I do remember reading, and I don't remember the source. It could be wrong. I have no idea that when the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, that we were not the only people that were slaves. There were other people who were slaves as well. If you have any information, please send it to me offline. But this whole renewed interest in Judaism does make a very strong point of what's happening here, this time period of Shivat Zion. Yes, there were Jews that were ignorant. We know that were Amei Haaretz. Yes, there are those who are intermarried. But nevertheless, there were many non-Jews that were being attracted to Judaism. So this is a kind of a balancing act of what's going on. This, like I say, a turn of where things are headed. So what about this oath that they're taking? So some of the things that they have accepted upon themselves are exactly explicitly what it says in the Torah. Some are not. Now, what was the first thing they said they're not going to do? Intermarry with any other nation. That's not what the Torah says. Hate to burst your bubble. According to the Torah, even though it becomes halacha later, the only nations a Jew was not allowed to marry into, non-Jewish world, were the 7 nations that occupied the land of Canaan. That's the Shivat Ha'amamim. That's the Torah level prohibition. It does not mean I'm telling you if you have a child who's marrying a non-Jew that it's okay. It's not, because it became the halacha that it is outlawing, and this could be traced possibly to this moment in time. There's a fancy word in English called exogamy. Exogamy, ex in Latin means outside, and ogamy, like monogamy, polygamy is marriage. So to marry out is the fancy word is exogamy. I think that's how it's pronounced. So that's one thing they commit to, that they're not going to marry outside any. Now that makes sense because the people that they came married to, that they were told to separate from, almost for sure were not the people, the Shivat Ha'amamim, because they were coming from Bavel with these people, so they weren't the people who were living in Israel. It wasn't the Chivi, the Prizi, we'll see any of those people. And the other thing is, and I'm going to leave off with this as kind of like a little question mark. The Torah, as I said, and we're going to read it this Shabbat, required the Bnei Yisrael to bring machatzit shekel, a half shekel. It's 50% of the shekel. And they commit to require a third of a shekel. So number one, why are they lowering the amount the Torah required? And number two, why is that of all the things, why is it that one of the things that they're committing to? We have a few things to discuss still next week. Let me just tell you, I have notes here. We have to talk a little bit more about the intermarriage issue, Shabbat commitment, Shemitah. We still resolve this 1/3 shekel business, the wood sacrifice, the Bikurim. So there's a bunch of stuff that's happening here in this chapter that not only has an impact on that moment in history, but also in future generations. Bezrat Hashem will continue next Sunday. Have a Shavuot.
Thank you.